Welcome to this short presentation which will give an overview of how teaching English to speakers of other languages, or TESOL, has developed over the last 200 years. The words displayed in this circular word cloud are some of the key terms used by the TESOL community around the world, which we hope you will become a part of. So by the end of these 5 slides, I hope your understanding of these terms will have developed. We will return to this word cloud in the next presentation. Remember that throughout this video, you can pause and repeat at any time if you want to. You are in control of the pace. Just move your cursor to the bottom of this video and the pause button will appear. So why do we need to look at the past development of TESOL? Well, mainly because the past has influenced the present, so it's still relevant. The teaching of modern languages has been evolving since the early 1800s. While many aspects of classroom methodology that were used back then are no longer practiced today, mainly because they weren't effective, there are some features that still survive and that you will be expected to practice in your classrooms during this course. The reason that these techniques have survived over time is because they are effective. They've yielded positive results for learners. Most of these successful techniques align with theories, either about learning in general or about learning languages. So it's also important for us to know about learning theories. The techniques we use in TESOL today, then, are essentially a mixture of old and new ideas that have been shown to yield positive results for speakers of other languages who are learning English. Let's go back in time to the early 1800s. This image shows a student in Victorian England. If he was learning French or German, his teachers would have used either the grammar translation or the direct method. These were the common methodologies of the day for teaching modern languages. The grammar translation method was essentially the same method that had been used previously to teach more ancient languages such as Latin and Greek. Latin is a systematic language that adheres closely to rules and patterns. Therefore, the main feature of the grammar translation method was to learn or teach those grammar rules. Once students had memorized them, they would apply them to the new or target language and translate it. The focus was on reading and analyzing language rather than on communication, so students had to learn to talk about the language using specialized terms, which we call meta-language. In today's TESOL classroom, we still use meta-language to explore grammar rules, but only when appropriate to the piece of language we're teaching. We do not expect learners to study meta-language as a subject in itself, as they did in the 1800s. English doesn't follow rules quite as systematically as Latin, so we can't actually teach all of it using rules. And grammar is only a part of language. There are many other aspects which require attention, such as vocabulary, phonology, reading, writing, listening, and speaking. In fact, the direct method was introduced largely because the grammar translation method ignored speaking and listening. As international travel became more affordable, people discovered a need to learn to speak other languages, which clearly the grammar translation method couldn't satisfy. A Frenchman called Sauveur advocated the direct method, which contrasted with the grammar translation method in several ways. In particular, the direct method encouraged students to think in the new or target language rather than translate it. Therefore, the teachers only used the target language in the classroom, so meanings were explained through pictures and objects. We still use images and objects, called realia, in TESOL today, because they tend to be memorable for most people. However, not all meanings can be expressed in this way, such as abstract nouns like beauty and education, so we can't always rely on this method. And although most TESOL teachers today will try to use the target language as much as possible in the classroom, in fact, sometimes they have no choice, as they don't always speak the students' native languages, there are instances when translation works well. Let's move on to the 20th century. This photograph shows a typical language learning laboratory, which some of you may have experienced yourselves when learning a foreign language at school. Language labs were developed when audiolingualism flourished as the method for learning languages. Audiolingualism was promoted by a behavioural psychologist called Skinner, who believed that language was a behaviour or a habit. Therefore, he thought that languages could be learnt rather in the same way that a dog learns a trick, through lots of repetition and praise when it's produced correctly. Mistakes were to be avoided or even punished. So, repetition of the teacher modelling a piece of language, or drilling, was a common classroom activity. Drilling still has a place in today's TESOL methodology. It is particularly useful for memorising short grammatical phrases and vocabulary, and for practising pronunciation in a non-threatening environment, because everyone speaks together. However, it would be extremely boring to use drilling for long periods of time, and it ignores other aspects of language, such as reading and writing. In the 1950s, a cognitive psychologist called Chomsky questioned the validity of behaviorism in language learning. He pointed out that a young child can produce a sentence that she or he has never spoken or heard before. Therefore, there must be some cognition or thinking involved in producing language, i.e., it is not a habit. Chomsky claimed that children learn language through experimentation. They try something out, and if it doesn't get the required response, they modify their language until it does. Therefore, unlike in audiolingualism, cognitivists claim that mistakes are a necessary feature of language learning. Many TESOL practitioners today agree with this view and encourage their students to try out new language without worrying about mistakes. Stephen Krashen went further with the idea of looking at how children acquire their native language with the natural approach. Krashen believed that teachers should apply some of the features of first language acquisition to second language learning in order to make it successful. He came up with 5 hypotheses. The 2 most relevant here are the input hypothesis and the filter hypothesis. Krashen believed that people learn new language when it's embedded in language they already know. Therefore, teachers should use texts in class that the students can understand most of. They will figure out the meaning of the new language from the context in which it is presented. He called this idea comprehensible input plus 1. The affective filter is said to be a kind of barrier that prevents the learner from understanding the target language when she or he is feeling anxious or embarrassed or bored, etc. However, if the learner feels relaxed and happy, the affective filter will be lowered and she or he will understand more easily. Most TESOL teachers agree with both these hypotheses. In this photograph, you can see 2 students practicing speaking. They're sitting back to back to simulate a telephone conversation where you wouldn't be able to see the person you're speaking to, although these days that's possible with Skype, etc. But here, the teacher has tried to make the context for the language practice as real or authentic as possible by sitting the students in this position. This photo is an example of communicative language teaching. Communicative language teaching was established in the 1970s, and the goal of this approach was to communicate competently, that is, to get your meaning across successfully. In order to do this, you need to know what to say and how to say it, which may be different depending on the context. For example, who you're talking to and the urgency of the situation both impact what kind of language you choose to get your meaning across most effectively. You may use very formal language in one situation, yet very informal language in another. For example, compare, "I'm awfully sorry to bother you, but could you help me with this?" with, "Give us a hand with this, would you?" with, "Help me!" So context became very important in the classroom, and there was less emphasis on getting the grammar right. This is because people are able to express meaning clearly, even if they make small grammar mistakes. The well-known PPP lesson structure became popular at this time, where at least 2/3 of the lesson were devoted to students practicing communication in the new language. Communicative language teaching is still common practice today, and many TESOL teachers set communicative competence as their aim. Task-based language learning also focuses on communication. This method became popular after N. Prabhu in India noticed that his students were very motivated to complete a task he had set them. Although they were practicing English whilst completing the task, it was actually the goal of completing the task successfully that drove them. The English practice seemed like a byproduct. This is in fact an authentic or realistic use of language. We use language in order to fulfill certain functions. So, TESOL practitioners often use authentic tasks as a vehicle for practicing English, such as organising a surprise birthday party for a friend. The students are free to choose what linguistic resources to use whilst completing the task, and the teacher gives feedback on their use of language at the end. The theory of multiple intelligences was developed by Dr. Howard Gardner in the 1980s. It's an idea about learning in general rather than language learning, but nevertheless useful for us. Dr. Gardner believes that there are different kinds of intelligences, such as linguistic intelligence, which means you have a good understanding of and memory for words and language, and logical mathematical intelligence, meaning you are good at thinking logically, resulting in good reasoning and number skills. Dr. Gardner identifies 8 different intelligences altogether and claims that traditional schooling only values the 2 I just mentioned, linguistic and logical mathematical intelligences. This is unfair, he claims, to people who have strength in other intelligences, such as visual spatial, which is having the ability to visualize things clearly and a good awareness of space, or intrapersonal intelligence, which means understanding and controlling your own emotions well. Gardner proposes that all 8 intelligences should be activated during learning, as everyone possesses them to different degrees and they are all valuable. Although Dr. Gardner's theory has many critics, it is widely acknowledged that people do learn better when stimulated in different ways. So we try to activate different aspects of intelligence in TESOL classrooms today. Now moving into the 21st century, and learning is still changing. In this final slide, You can see a classroom that's very rich in technology, with an interactive whiteboard, personal computers and tablets, as well as mobile phones and iPods. It's widely acknowledged that technology is changing the way we learn. These two learning theories again do not refer to learning language in particular, but they're much discussed in education circles and we should be aware of them. Social constructivism has its roots in Lev Vygotsky's ideas from the 1920s. Vygotsky, a developmental psychologist from Belarus, believed that language and thought were interconnected, so much so that children learn better when they talk about their learning, especially with adults who are more knowledgeable, so can guide or scaffold them. Social constructivism today believes that people construct their own knowledge through discussion. That is, they reach an understanding of things by verbalizing their thoughts and getting feedback from others. In a constructivist classroom, the teacher will set up a discussion and guide the learners towards understanding, rather than provide them with the knowledge. Some aspects of teaching and learning in TESOL classrooms today also follow the idea of social constructivism. For example, teachers might encourage their learners to discuss language errors and reach a conclusion among themselves about the correct way to express something. Connectivism is relatively new and has been dubbed a learning theory for the digital age. Siemens explains that technology has changed the way we store and access knowledge. There's so much available, and it often becomes obsolete so quickly that we can no longer know knowledge ourselves. He proposes that knowing where to find appropriate information at the time when you need it and what to do with that information to solve your particular issue is a crucial life skill. Maintaining and nurturing connections with people and knowledge systems will be vital. Certainly, most educators agree that digital fluency, or the ability to communicate safely and effectively online, is a necessary skill in the developed world. As educators concerned with fluency in English, which is the most common language used on the internet, TESOL practitioners should also be concerned with improving their learners' digital fluency. So that's the end of this presentation on the development of TESOL. If you would like to find out more about the theories and methods mentioned here, click on the links at the bottom of this page. When you're ready, watch the video below, which will review the main points of this presentation.